Man, that was a great sermon, wasn't it?
Can't wait for
When
youth
you talk
group on
about-
Wednesday.
I know, it's going to be so much fun. The teacher is supposed to be really, really good. Yeah, that new band sounds so cool.
Oh yeah. Stevie! Stevie, what's up with you?
Brian, come run with me.
All right.
No, Ryan, we're not going to run on the patio.
Yes, Dad.
And welcome to our very first session of Growing Kids God's Way. We just saw a scenario of a little guy running around on the church patio, Anne-Marie, tempting his little friend, and Mom and Dad stepping in to stop that. In this particular lesson, we are going to talk about how to help children internalize values, but it means more than just instructing and telling them what not to do. We're going to discover the real secret of how to help children truly take those values and place them into their hearts, and the role that parents play in the process.
And we're also going to cover how to help you as parents not become legalistic in your parenting or remove all boundaries.
That's right. All of this is coming up in this very first session of Growing Kids God's Way. We'll be right back with our class. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to our very first session of Growing Kids God's Way. I want you to know that as often as I teach this particular session and this lesson and communicate these principles, I do so with a great sense of urgency. And I also trust that you came to this class with a great sense of urgency, with an open, teachable spirit. Especially when you consider the significance of child training, when you think about the awesome responsibility that we have. We believe that one of the greatest areas of concern that you should have for your children is a concern over your children's moral health. Too many young parents today are overly concerned about the psychological health of their children, but they're not sufficiently concerned about the moral health of their child. Yet we understand that the right standard of moral training and the right method of moral training should be a preoccupation with you, because moral training, right biblical moral training, is the medicine preventing your child's emotional deficiencies. And that statement leads me to the purpose of Growing Kids God's Way and really why we are here. Growing Kids God's Way is all about helping parents in their duty of raising morally responsible and biblically responsive children. One of our goals in this series is to help you help your child internalize biblical values. That means parents must not only give consideration, listen, to what is imparted, but you need to also give consideration to how you impart moral truth to your children. Because obviously methods matter. Methods in the past and even some methods presently in our society are just not sufficient. In fact, let's go to C on our outline and look at the examples, a few examples of this. We can talk about the authoritarian and permissive parenting, these two extremes. I'd like to spend a few moments just to discuss this, because I really believe if you understand these two extremes, you'll better rightly understand the centerpiece of biblical parenting. Let's talk about the authoritarian parenting and think back when you were a child. How were you parented? The authoritarian parenting model was really the cultural norm for the first 60 years of this century. That is, the power of authority was the primary driving force that brought moral conformity in the family, but also in the society. Many years ago, under the authoritarian model, a child was told, "You will do it or else." Now, please understand this. The or else became the motivation for right behavior, not moral principle. I remember growing up under the Judeo-Christian ethic. I remember when my dad would say, "Gary, you will do that or else." I knew or else. Or else wasn't fun. Or else wasn't pretty. What motivated me to avoid wrong and what motivated me to do right was not the love of virtue. It was not principle instilled in my heart, but as a member of an entire generation, we did right out of the fear of reproof. Now, under the authoritarian parenting, mothers and fathers tend to be more preoccupied with suppressing evil in their children, that is, suppressing waywardness in their children, than they are elevating good. That is, they are more concerned with stifling rebellion than they are teaching virtuous living. What is a dangerous point of this is that we spend so much time on restraining the wrong and so little time on elevating good that ultimately the pathway to goodness is warped. Children don't have a right view. We distort what good really looks like. You see, many parents focus their energies on restraining unruly behavior. They predominantly train by correcting the negatives, and of course that's just not sufficient. They often parent in moments of conflict, and they train out of frustration or embarrassment. Don't we all do that sometimes? I know I did. You're at church and you're standing there with your child and someone comes up and extends a courtesy to your child. They say, "Pretty ribbons in your hair," or "That's a handsome jacket." And instead of getting a thank you or a courtesy back, your child ignores that person. And so you, rightly so, you begin to deal with the child and correct the child. You begin to teach the child a moral lesson about how they are supposed to respond under these moments of courtesies. Think about it, moms. How many times this week in your parenting, when you were correcting the child, did you train your child in some type of morality? Rightfully so. Now compare that. How many times this week in moments of non-conflict did you teach your children what virtue looks like, apart from having to correct them? You see, it's natural for us to try to suppress the waywardness in our children. And it's in that moment that we tend to do all of our training. But if all of our training is done then, and it's not done in moments of non-conflict when we could be elevating good, again, what we're ultimately going to do is we're going to distort what good really looks like. Now, opposite and more socially destructive is the permissive parenting philosophies. Since the late 1960s, permissive theories have really dominated the American culture. For the most part, permissive parenting is neither concerned with suppressing evil or elevating good, but rather it's the method of parenting that is elevated above the results. Permissive parents tend to be more preoccupied with the psychological health of their child than their moral health. What they're really looking for is the happiness quotient. They're trying to create an environment that is stress-free so that the child will continually be happy. So feelings then, not the child's behavior, becomes the basis of their ethics. Now, practically speaking, the permissive parent would rather chase after the child than teach the child not to make a mess. For example, the permissive parent has been known to put a swimming pool, you know, a child's swimming pool. Mom blows it up and puts it underneath the child's high chair. That way, if the child drops food off of the high chair, then the only thing mom has to do is really take this little swimming pool, take it outside, hose it down, and let the dog lick the food. Now, she believes that is, although physically more difficult to do, it is much easier than training the child not to drop the food in the first place. Because if you're going to train the child not to drop the food, there's going to be conflict. There is going to be tension between what is right and what the child wants to do. And so in permissive parenting, that tension is removed by not putting any serious demands on the child. That is the way of permissive parents. When conflict avoidance, ladies and gentlemen, is elevated above conflict resolution, when psychological health is elevated above moral health, when a child's happiness is elevated above his holiness, ultimately biblical values have to be disregarded, and true biblical parenting has to be forsaken to the detriment of the child, of the family, and ultimately all of society. Now, we believe both extremes are wrong, both are detrimental to the welfare of children, and that is why Anne-Marie and I, through Growing Kids God's Way, will endeavor to guide your children according to the basic rules of biblical ethics for parenting. And that statement, that last statement, leads us to the investigation of biblical ethics in Growing Kids God's Way. There are really 4 questions that we're going to address in this particular session, foundational questions that need to be answered. First, if we're going to raise a morally responsible, biblically responsive child, then what is the standard? Where do our values come from? That's the first question. A second question that we're going to talk about is what role does temperament and personality play in the training process? Realizing how unique every child is, what consideration do we give to that uniqueness? Number 3, with whom does moral training really begin with? And then number 4, the all-important question, how do you actually raise a morally responsible child? A child that can take the extrinsic influences in his life from mom and dad and place them in his own heart, make them intrinsic. Let's get started with our very first question. If we're going to raise a morally responsible and biblically responsive child, then what is the standard? Where do our values come from? What is the basis of our ethics? Why do we believe what we believe? First of all, Anne-Marie and I believe, of all of the ethical systems in the world, that there is no higher standard, nor more pure motive for right behavior than the standard that comes from the Bible. Now follow this, please, because the justification for that statement is rather basic. Only the system of biblical ethics is other-oriented, not as a way of salvation, but as a result of salvation. Look, Christian, understand this. As Christians, we've already come to the heavenly Jerusalem. Hebrews 12:22 tells us we're numbered among innumerable angels. We're already in heaven. We do not do right in pursuit of salvation. We do right because we're already in heaven and with our salvation. So our response in doing right, our motive for doing right, is a love response back to God. Now, there are many religions that are other-oriented. There are many ethical systems derived from these religions that do many wonderful things for humanity. But understand, they do wonderful things not because they're already in heaven, but because they're trying to pursue heaven. That is, their efforts to do good is merely to help them gain entrance to heaven. Not so for us, praise God. It was all done for us. You're already in heaven. So when we do right, ethically, morally, it's a love response to God. Let me expand on this with an analogy that comes out of our own family. One Christmas, many years ago, we gave our youngest daughter, Jennifer, a little doll, a little Holly Hobbie doll. And I think you moms can best relate with this. You know that when you give your little girl a favorite doll, that little doll seems to go everywhere that your little daughter goes. And so it was with Jennifer. And Jennifer loved this little Holly Hobbie doll. It was so special to her. And sometimes she gave me, gentlemen, as dad, the special privilege when she was playing with that little doll. She would say, Daddy, she would look up, would you hold Holly Hobbie? I'm going to make her bed now. And so I would hold Holly Hobbie. You know, while she was making up the bed, I'd look at this thing and I think, my goodness, it's stained, it's tattered, it's torn, an eye has already been replaced. It would be cheaper for us to go out and buy her a new one than the cost it is just to maintain this thing. But I held Holly Hobbie not based upon the value that I placed on it. I held Holly Hobbie based upon the value its owner placed on it. Now you see, to Jennifer, that Holly Hobbie doll was absolutely precious. In fact, the more beat up it got, the more tattered and torn, the more it received her love. In the true sense, you are like that Holly Hobbie doll in humanity. You have an owner. To your owner, Jesus Christ, you are absolutely precious. You are so precious that He left the splendor of heaven to come to earth to die for you. He made you in His image. You are redeemable. You are savable. He poured His love out for you. Now, my behavior towards you is not based upon how valuable you are to me. Now get this, Christian, because this is the core of the biblical ethic. My behavior towards you is based upon how precious you are to God. That's it. Because you are the target of His love. You are the target of His preciousness. Therefore, I am to order my behavior in that direction. So we could ask, what is the ethical, moral mandate of Scripture? It's this. It's looking and responding to the preciousness of those outside of self. Not at the expense of self, but in harmony with self. It's living out a manner of life that is reflective of Christ in us, according to Philippians 2:3-5. Jesus set the ethical standard by being other-oriented, and we are to follow that example by ordering our behavior in view of the preciousness of others. And that involves giving consideration to those who come behind us. You ever think about that? Do you ever think about there's someone coming behind you, always, every day? There are people in front of you. There are people on your sides. That what biblical ethics involves itself with is a rational preoccupation with the people who are all around us. That's what biblical ethics is all about. And that biblical ethic must be transferred into your children. This is not simply an adult ethic. This is not an ethic that is something that is reserved for those who are of legal age. This is an ethic that we begin early to put into the heart of our children, that otherness sensitivity. For the community of believers, what is at stake is really our Christian witness. Literally a Christian witness. You see, no non-Christian can damage a case for biblical ethics as badly as a Christian parent whose children are continually out of control, and maybe even more frightening is a mom and dad who continually makes excuses for that child being out of control. And then that leads us to our second question, because there will be people who will come and say to us, and they do, Gary, I understand where values come from. I understand what you are saying. I understand the importance of holiness. I understand the importance of an ethic that is other-oriented. But Gary, you've never met my child. My child is absolutely different, implying that personality and temperament differences exempts the child from biblical standards of behavior. Let's take up the second question here. What role does temperament and personality differences play in moral training? All parents should be working towards the same standard of moral excellence, regardless of their child's personality or temperament. Here we are talking, ladies and gentlemen, about the standard, not the means to the standard, just the standard. You see, many parents are guilty of dismissing the need for virtuous training based on their child's uniqueness. And that's when we commonly hear, oh, but my child is different. Oh, really, we will say. The old "but my child is different" is not a legitimate exception clause in the ethical scheme of the Bible. We recognize the fact, believe me, that all children are different. From birth they are different. Clay and Eleanor have 7 of them. Are any of them alike from different? You got triplets and twins. They're not alike, are they? From birth they are different. We want you to know. We know a brother and sister can be as different as the little boy next door. Of course. Each child possesses a unique combination of temperament and personality that distinguishes him or her from all other children. But personality development and moral training are not the same thing. You see, personality, we could define it this way. Personality is the house. Temperament is the foundation. That's what God gives us. Your child is born with a unique temperament. That's the foundation. Personality is the house. That temperament enters a family. And a personality is formed. That's the house. But when we talk about moral character, moral training, we're talking about the craftsmanship that goes into building the house. You see, you all have different foundations. And you all have different shaped houses. You understand? What we're talking about is not the uniqueness of the house. We're talking about the craftsmanship that went into building the house. That's moral character. You see, regardless of the personality distinctions found in your families, the persistence of moral training should not vary from child to child, because God's moral requirements do not vary from child to child. Your children all represent different personality types. In fact, we could use you in this room as an illustration. Let's divide the room up. Let's say over here we have personality types A, and we'll put you guys, we'll make you guys the B's, and you be the C's, and then we have the D's, and over here we have the type E's, all right? So we have these 5 different personality types. Now, based upon your unique personality type, let me ask you these questions. Who in this room, which one among you, based upon your uniqueness, based upon your temperament, based upon your type, who in this room is exempt from honesty? Any of you? Who in this room is exempt from kindness? Because you're unique. Who in this room is exempt from honor, integrity, endurance, obedience, and all of the other virtues? Obviously none of us. Why? Well, because the standard doesn't change, the morality doesn't change because each one is different. The very fact that each one is different complements God's greatness in creation because He's showing the whole world, even with the differences, there is something in the heart that is the same. That is His values. And that's what binds us together. It will always bind us together. Parents need to recognize and appreciate the uniqueness of each child, but understand that uniqueness has nothing to do with the standard of ethical training. Believe me, mothers will come up to me and say, but Gary, I understand, but you don't know my child. I have this little guy right here, and he is a fireball. He's always on the go. I can barely keep up with him. And then I have my daughter, Sarah, and she's, Sarah, Mom's going to take a shower. Mom, if you're going to take a shower, may I press some clothes for you? And you say, she says, do you see the difference? Do you see the difference? And I will say back to the mom, of course I see the difference. Do you see the difference? Do you realize that you're probably not going to have a problem with this little guy saying hello to Mr. Ezra on Sunday morning? Now, you may have a problem in that he's going to tell me everything about your family that I shouldn't know, but you're not going to have a problem. This child over here who you think is so good, now, this one's going to be able to get away with a lot of different sins. Now, you probably will have difficulty in bringing her to the moral standard in something as basic as a simple courtesy. You see, we do understand all children are different. But what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to bring the child to the standard. We're not supposed to plastic coat our children, like, here's the standard, and, oh, Sarah's pretty good, bring her here, and then this one, oh, he's real bad, bring the standard, and, well, this one's here. No. What we do, ladies and gentlemen, is we bring the child to the standard. We love him to the standard, we correct him to the standard, we encourage him to the standard, and we live the standard. We bring the child to the standard. We do not bring the standard to the child. The means and how we do that, we will discuss that later in Growing Kids God's Way. Right now, understand that there is a standard. Let's go on to that third question. With whom does moral training begin? Well, really, the place we start is with the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 6:4-6. Here, Moses is now preparing the people to go into the land. He's giving them this final charge. He is, interestingly enough, he is not telling the leadership of Israel what to do. Listen to this. It's very important that you understand this history. He is telling the parents what to do. That has always been the way of God. Do you realize He advances His kingdoms through parents and families, not through nations? It is not the nation of Israel, but the families that made up the nation of Israel that God did His work. It is not the church at large, but the families in the church that God does His work. Same thing is true here. This is what Moses told Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And then he went on and he said this, and these words, which I'm commanding you this day, shall be in your heart. Now, ladies and gentlemen, everyone is familiar with Deuteronomy 6:6 or 6:7. But not so many are familiar with Deuteronomy 6:6. It's an amazing thing. We're all familiar with and diligently teach our children. But back up one verse. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying, moms and dads, if the precepts of moral truth are not first taking resident in your heart, then you're not going to train them and put them into the heart of your children. This is the whole thing. If the principles of moral conduct are not in your heart, how are you going to get them to your children? You say, well, we got a great Sunday school program. But that's not God's plan. Well, you know what? My kids go to a Christian school. That wasn't God's plan. God bless us, but that's not God's plan. We have some really great homeschool curriculum. That's not God's plan. You see, what God is saying is, moms and dads, all moral training in the heart of your child, in the life of your child, begins with you. You. If the principles of moral conduct are not first resident in your heart, then how will you ever train your children? It's interesting when Moses does go on to Deuteronomy 6:7, he talks about training and training children diligently. He talks about training them in periods of non-conflict. Have you ever noticed that? He says, and when you're sitting and when you're walking, and in the nighttime and in the daytime, teach your children. These are all periods of non-conflict. Obviously, God impressed upon Moses to impress upon the children of Israel that some of the greatest periods of moral training is not when you are correcting them. That needs to be done. But really, the greatest period of moral training takes place in periods of non-conflict in everyday life. Finally, we get over to question 4. How do you raise a morally responsible child? Oh, we have seen so often parents who invest their whole life into their children. Let's see, they start out and make sure we got the infant dedicated, and then they're in science school and they're in church and they go to all the camps and they become Christianized, you know, and they spend 6 months at the university, their first 6 months, and they turn their backs on everything they've learned. And parents come to us and say, why? Why does that happen? How could that happen? I raised them in the church. What we believe often explains the situation is that parents are raising children that are simply moral on the outside, but not necessarily moral on the inside. And there's a reason for that. The reason we are not producing morally responsible children so often in our churches is because of this. Listen to this. This is so simple. It's because parental instruction too often lacks moral reason. Parental instruction too often lacks moral reason. What do I mean by that? We tell our children what to do, but not tell them why they should do it. And that one ingredient is absolutely necessary for producing a morally responsible child that has internalized God's values. Because listen, knowing how to do right and knowing why to do right are distinctly two different things. The first one represents moral action. The second one represents moral principle. You see, many children know how to live right. Many children know where to stand. They know how to act when they go to grandma's house. They know how to act when they go to science school or they go over to Mr. and Mrs. Ezell's house. But not so many children know the reason why. That's when you end up with a child that is moral on the outside, but not moral on the inside. They're simply trained to respond to little vignettes, to life. They're trained to action, but they're not trained to principle. They have no knowledge of the reason behind the moral instruction. They know how to live it, but they don't know how to think it. Now, when we say parents should provide a why in their instructions, let me give you a caution here. It does not mean parents are obliged to provide an explanation on demand. So many young moms are concerned about this. Please understand, that's not what we're saying. There will be times when your instruction is based simply on this. Now, moms, this may be freeing for some of you. It's simply based on this one great truth. Because I'm the mommy. I'm the mommy. That is sufficient. With these little ones, 18 months and 2 years and up to 3, because I'm the mommy is a sufficient reason. When I talk about the why on demand, we're not talking about a child that says, well, mommy, why? Why do I have? That's not the why. And again, there will be some whys that are just because I'm mommy. What we are saying is by the time the child hits 3 years of age, parental instruction should become more characterized by including the moral reason why when you give moral instructions. Let me pick up on this a little further by giving an illustration. Anne-Marie and I are associated with an educational experiment that measures the relationship between moral excellence and academic achievement in a school environment. And we're working with this little group of parents in what is called the community school. Now, in order to get into the community school, besides being like-minded, our children have to go through, number one, a moral readiness evaluation and an academic readiness evaluation. Now, the reason we put them through a moral readiness evaluation is because we really do believe that if a child is not morally ready to sit with his peers, then he probably is not going to be academically ready. And so we set up moral interviews. And I've had, in the past, the opportunity to sit on some of these interviews and conduct these interviews. And what we do is in fact, we interview children, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and we set up a number of moral scenarios. And then we ask the child to explain them. For example, I would say to a 5 or 6-year-old who may be coming into kindergarten, I would say, now, Susie, if you were over to Mr. and Mrs. Ezell's house for dinner with your family, and Mrs. Ezell has just cleaned off the dinner table, and now she brings back a delicious dessert, and it's put in front of everyone. Tell me, Susie, when would you eat your dessert? And the children that were trained in right moral action would give us the answer. That child would say, well, we would wait for Mrs. Ezell to sit down before we started. And I would say, Susie, that is very good, very good. But then I would ask the most significant question. Now, Susie, you tell me, why would you wait? The why. And children who are trained in moral principle, not just action, would then be able to tell us, well, for us to eat our dessert before Mrs. Ezell sat down, that would be dishonoring the one who served us. We would not be esteeming her higher. You see, here are children who not only know how to do the right thing, they know how to think morally. They have that moral self-control, and that's what we're talking about. That's what we want for your children. Okay. Let me expand this a little bit further by going back to the scenario that we saw at the top of our presentation. We saw a little guy running around. We'll call him Stevie. I think we've all seen these scenarios on our own church patios. Little Stevie's running around the patio after church service, and he's calling his little friend Ryan. He's saying, "Ryan, come run with me." But Ryan's mom and dad, standing right there, realized that that would not be a good idea, so they just stopped Ryan. And they said, "No, Ryan." Now that's where the scenario stopped, with just "No, Ryan, you're not going to run." But actually what these parents did to take it into the next level is they did something that was truly reflective of biblical parenting. They stopped Ryan, but they went further. They showed him why running on the patio was not right. In essence, they gave him the moral reason why. They said, "Ryan, do you see all of the people there after church? Do you see the people who are coming out of the Sunday school classroom, some of them with coffee, moms with little babies? You see the people lining up to sign up for different events, and some of the people have canes and some people are in wheelchairs?" This is why Ryan running around on the church patio or in any setting like this is not a wise thing to do, because it's very frightening to some people, especially people walking with canes. That's why Ryan is best to stay by our side. Now here's what you need to understand. Today, Ryan's behavior has been controlled by mom and dad by their very presence. But let's extend this hypothetical. Let's say that Ryan's parents simply said, "Ryan, you're not running with Stevie, you stay by our side." And they never gave him the moral reason why. Now this is what we found to be the norm. Next week, when Stevie's out on the patio running around, and Ryan's parents are still in their Sunday school classroom, and Stevie says, "Ryan, come run with me, come run with me." Ryan now has no good reason not to run. And the reason for that condition is because no principle or reason was ever placed in his heart. You see, his mom and dad last week suppressed potential waywardness by saying, "Ryan, don't run." But they never placed anything, they never deposited any principle into the heart of their son. So Ryan has no moral reason not to join Stevie. Might as well join him. Because in the mind of a child, today's no, without moral principle, is only for today. And that's why giving your child the moral reason why is so important. Now, we have to understand too, folks, a very important word. The word that we want you to remember throughout all of your parenting is the word context. Context. It is such a critical parenting word. You know what context does? It prevents you from becoming a legalist. A legalist is someone who elevates human tradition above biblical truth. A legalist is someone who does not look into context. You see, Ryan's parents could easily become a legalist. Ryan's parents, and some of you may have already thought about this, how you can control your child from running on the church patio without ever giving him the moral reason why. The only thing you need to do is say, "Ryan, whenever we're at church, I don't ever, 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 ever want you to run." There. All done. Fixed. Now he'll never run. And we will say to you, "Never run." What about next Saturday when they're on the patio and they're going to do the Awana tryouts? What about if there was an emergency and the church doctor, the church nurse asked your son to run and get the emergency kit? What's he going to do? Walk fast? What do you mean never run? You see, once you make these laws absolute, when they can't be absolute, you've just lapsed into legalism. Legalism is a very frightening condition. Legalism removes the principle from the heart and soul of a child. Let me give you another illustration of what this looks like. Ryan, in another setting, his dad said to him in the evening, "Ryan, I want you to stay in your bed. I don't want you getting out. I don't want you turning on that light switch." Father was expecting complete obedience from that. Now, in the middle of the night, Ryan's little brother fell out of bed. And Ryan got out of bed, turned on the light switch, and he began to comfort him and put the little brother back into his bed. Now, the legalist would say, it was good, but he disobeyed his father. We would say, no, he did not disobey his father. because it was never his father's original intent to keep Ryan in bed under all circumstances. And yet our greatest fear, folks, and I'm going to begin to close with this, our greatest fear is that some of you right now may have children who would have laid frozen stiff in that bed and would not have gotten out to do that which is morally right. And listen, because your child was trained to the letter of the law and not the greater principle behind it. And that's what ends up happening. Whenever you train your child to your word rather than to the word, whenever you train the child to the letter of the law and not the greater principle behind it, you end up robbing the child of the ability to actually serve others. They don't know. He won't get out of bed. He doesn't know. Is it right? Is it wrong? He has nothing to liberate him, to help him think morally. See, when you deposit the moral reason why into the hearts of your children, nothing's going to stop them. When you give them the moral reason why and you explain why it's so, nothing's going to hold them back, even in the academic setting. The moral reason is what drives the child because it affects everything, every element, every aspect of a child. And it's so beautiful. Let me close with this interview story that I participated in at the community school. I had an 8-year-old sit in front of me. And her parents have been teaching Growing Kids God's Way for years. So I figured this interview would be a snap. And so I said to this little 8-year-old who was going to be coming in for the very first time, I gave her an easy scenario. I said to little Leah, I said, Leah, if you were on a bus and there were no more seats on the bus, you had the last one, and then the bus stopped and you saw an older person get on the bus and they were looking for a seat, honey, what would you do? And that little 8-year-old put her little head down, and at that moment I thought, she doesn't know. Our parents have been teaching Growing Kids for years. She doesn't know. But my assessment was hasty and it was completely wrong because she was just processing. And then she picked her little head up with a beautiful smile. She said, well, she said, it all depends. She said, if there's a sign on the bus that says children are not allowed to stand while the bus is in motion, then I would scoot over and let the person sit with me. But if there was no such sign, then I would get up and let the person have my seat. Because Leah understood Leviticus 19:32, rise up before the hoary head and honor age. What is amazing about this child, this 8-year-old mind now, what you have to appreciate is her introduction of the sign. By introducing that sign, she created a condition in ethics where you had two competing values. There was the value of the importance of respecting and obeying the authority over you, represented by the sign. And you had another value, honoring age. Both values are now calling for simultaneous attention. Here's an 8-year-old child that was able to satisfy both values without compromising either one. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to tell you that this young child is an ordinary child, but who had a mom and dad who took the time to invest moral truth into her life. And that's what we're asking for you, to understand the profundity of what happens in the life of a child when you deposit into their hearts, through instruction, the greatness of God's moral law. You are going to change the world with your child. Understand this, it is not enough for you to teach your child how to act morally. They need to learn how to think morally. But it really begins with you, Mom and Dad. Do you know why right is right and wrong is wrong? Do you have the moral reason why in your moral warehouse? As we go throughout Growing Kids God's Way, we trust we're going to be able to help deposit some of those great moral truths that will help you be great moral parents. Right now, let's go to wrap up and get some input from Anne-Marie on this all-important first lesson. Well, Anne-Marie, here we are in our very first wrap-up, in our very first session, How to Raise a Moral Child. In one sense, I wish I had maybe 2 or 3 weeks to develop that entire theme because there really is so much there.
There is, and I'm sure as a class, there's been a lot of information disseminated out to all of you this evening, and so you're probably just trying to process it. And it's really like this is the first step in your journey. We're going to be spending literally months together going through the process of parenting. And some of you, I'm sure, are sitting there thinking, oh great, I'm supposed to communicate the moral reason why to my children, and I don't have a clue what the moral reason why is, I tell my children, it's like, okay, yeah, my parents told me you don't do this, and there was a lot of training in the suppressing the evil, but I don't know why. And so part of what I'd like to share with you, and it's something that we had to learn in the process of our parenting, is going to the Word of God. And when you do that, read it now with the intent of finding out what is the moral reason why, because He usually gives it to us. And I'm going to just give you an illustration from just Philippians in chapter 2, verse 14. It's a verse, if you haven't used it yet with your children, you undoubtedly will somewhere in your parenting process. It says, do all things without complaining and disputing. And most moms, somewhere along the line, say, will you two stop arguing? Will you just do what I ask you without arguing with me? So it takes some sort of a form. Well, that's the standard that God gives us. In the next verse, in 15, He gives the reason why. Now, you don't have to go into this detail with your children. It says that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Well, you can summarize that all, especially with your little children, that, you know what, when you do all things without grumbling, complaining, you are a light to the world. And they can understand the concept of light, and then you can build as they get older. And I also realize that there are those of you that are joining us in this class that you're thinking, I've never even considered that the Word of God has standards for me to live my life by. I might not even have a Bible. And so we're just very grateful that you've decided to join us in a Growing Kids God's Way class, and that hopefully over the next 18 weeks you will realize that God does have all of the answers that we need for life. And you may become very familiar with the Bible and to see the answers that are there. But just a couple of little reminders of things just from tonight's class that can start you off in your parenting. Think about the preciousness of others. You know, just even over the next week, if your children, there's little behaviors that you're going to see, you might say, now, do you think you treated your brother in a precious way? Get them to start thinking that way about their acts of kindness, or that when they have unkind acts, start to think them down that road of being preciousness. I also want to let you know, and you'll hear this many times over the next many weeks, parenting is a process. Each week you're going to receive lots of information, and there's no way you're going to be able to assimilate it all at one time. So be patient with yourself, be patient with your children. It's going to be a process. Each week is going to build on itself. You will also find out, if you haven't already, that parenting is a wonderful opportunity for us to grow. God uses it to reveal many of our strengths and many of our weaknesses, and so we will all grow in the whole process. Want to encourage you really too to start thinking through what are the moral reasons why. Just be asking yourself when you're giving an instruction, okay, what is the moral reason? And sometimes there are practical reasons as well that we want to give our children. And you probably would wish, well, just tell us what we need to do. You know, give us a list. But we would be very poor disciplers if we did that, because part of the discipling process is to get you to think. And that's another goal that we hope to accomplish over the next many weeks and months that we have together to think. And one other little reminder too, as you begin to become more comfortable with giving the moral reason why, just because you give it once doesn't mean it's going to sink in. Some of these moral reasons you will give over and over and over again. And you'll think of different ways of giving it to your children. And for those of you that are starting out with older children and you start to give those moral reasons why, the time will come when you'll say, okay, now you tell me why. It seems like most of our grandchildren, of which we have 6 and 5 that speak.
Because the youngest one's
not old enough to speak yet. Thank you for that clarity. They all go through that period of why. And some of it, you know, is just curiosity, and some of it might be challenging, but some of it is just the childish why. And there's nothing wrong with going back to them, you tell me why. And then they can tell you why. So those are just some little things to think about.
Honey, thinking of the moral reason why, I think that, and speaking of repetition, I think it's important that we continue to put before our families tonight, in this crucial very first lesson, some of these illustrations that over the years we have accumulated. But I think of one that's just precious to us, because it was a scene where Mom was working with little Shane, And as Shane went into the store, he had this habit. He just loved, you know the numbers that slide, that give you the price? Well, he just loved to bring all the numbers and change them. And his mom worked with him and dealt with him and disciplined him. But that temptation was so great. And then she sat in and she heard this lesson for the very first time. And I think Shane was, what, 3.5, maybe 4? And had a little sister who was 2.5? And so for that day, when she realized that there's Shane, he's beginning to move the numbers, this is the next day, and it dawned on her. She said, Shane, let me tell you why we don't move the numbers. And she began to explain, if you move the numbers, then the people coming behind us will not know how much the commodity would be, or how much the price of the cookies would be, or how much the bread is. That's why we don't move the numbers. All of a sudden, it dawned on Shane. That made sense. And in fact, it made so much sense, he turned to his little sister and said, Shannon, do you know why you're not supposed to move numbers? But the point is, here is Mom. This is a behavior. She was struggling with it. She disciplined him. She isolated him. She did everything. She talked to him. What took care of it? In this case, simply giving the moral reason why. And so often, that's all. You talked about the practical reason why. Can we go there?
Before we do.
Okay.
This is a great illustration, too, of how the moral reason why got to the heart of the child. Because I know that some parents would say, well, he should have just not touched that because the mother said not to touch that. But we're trying to reach our child's heart. And it's the moral reason why, that principle, that's going to get to the heart. And so, like Gary said, it made sense. It appealed to his heart, and the whole concept is now going to take root. She could continue telling him, and obviously she had, week after week, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But until it was the truth of God's Word that took some root into his heart, there was no real motivation not to.
Well, let me just piggyback off of that.
Okay.
If you do not give your child the moral reason why, when it's appropriate, not all of your instructions is moral. When you say to your little one, honey, you need to go brush your teeth and get ready for bed, there's nothing moral about that. That's health and safety. So when we're dealing with moral reasons why, if you don't give it, then what you're doing is simply trying to control the child. You control by discipline or by threat, whatever it is. When you give the moral reason why, that is when the child begins to grow. I was going to go to the practical illustration. Nathan saw his dad do something with the fruit trees, and Nathan started going over, and his father caught hold of this and said, Nathan, don't go by the fruit trees. He said, I just sprayed poison around them. Now what happened is, by giving that little bit of information, just by saying, this is what Dad has done, this is why I don't want you to go there, now the temptation to go explore is lessened, simply because Nathan now understands, oh, okay. See, if Dad simply said, Nathan, don't go over by the trees, well, there's that lingering, well, what's over there? Why? And so what we end up doing is we almost end up encouraging our children to wrong because we fail to provide, in this case, the practical reason why. What else do you have, honey? Anything more on this?
Well, I really think those are enough points in one sense to start off with.
Okay.
And part of your homework is going to be not only to read through the lesson, but take opportunities this week to start presenting the moral reason why for behavior.
We do have one more thing that we do want to share. You touched on it a little bit earlier, but what about for the mom and dad whose parents raised them with don't do this, don't touch that, be good, but never gave the moral reason why? The question so commonly comes to us, well, what about us? How are we going to learn? And what we're going to say to you is, you spend the next 16 to 17 weeks with us. We will teach you the moral reason why, because you need to know it in order to give it to your children. Thanks for joining us in this very first session. As you said, honey, we have homework. You need to go to your 3-ring binder and put into the binder, actually, go to your folders, put into your binder your lesson, this very first lesson. Don't forget to do your homework. Men, don't let your wife do your homework. You men do your homework, okay? And we'll see you back in a little bit. Let's have some dessert right now.